was very much a place to put stuff out there and see what comes back. You know, in my case, I wasn't feeling very pressured to present a sort of unified theoretical framework in a way. It was more like, here's an idea. What do you think about it? You know, and I think giving people an opportunity to mull this over, think about it, and then maybe just even in text, leave short comments, you know, or links to interesting readings or anything like that would be really useful.
But you were having feedback in the chat. I at least remember that I was giving into references to games, to the papers, please, and Through the Darkest of Times, which reminded me very much of your work. So I think it's also useful if you were saving the chat, then you could have a look also to it. So we were usually also doing that, saving the chat and then looking at least to the commentaries. So yeah, that's a start already. Thank you.
I'm hoping that I have saved the chat. I have been recording these sessions, but thanks, Lucas. We're actually looking at developing the ARA website on the School of Arts, your sub website within the School of Arts website, and posting a lot of resources related to us artistic research. So that's a great idea. We will certainly take that up, but it will take us a few weeks. We're in the process of doing that, but we will notify everybody who's been involved in this colloquium when that material is available. But that's a great idea. Thanks a lot. Brett, I see your hands up, or is it an old hand, as you always say?
Thanks. I think Fiona's hand was up first, but I'd love to go later. Thanks.
Okay, Fiona, please.
Yes, hi, thanks. My question is actually for Petro. For Petro, she mentioned that the moment of transformation, there was something interesting about the moment of transformation. And she's picked up on something that's really what I was trying to interrogate. And I didn't quite know how I go about it, but without, you know, it's the moment of transformation when the actor becomes the other person, and obviously the process that gets you there, but that moment of, so maybe if she could elaborate on that, or anybody else could just speak to that, how I would investigate that moment of, or maybe can feed into that. That would be helpful.
Thank you, Fiona. What struck me in your presentation is how you as a performer moved in the presentation from presenting the research to embodying the character. And that is a natural shift for you. That's something a performer does. And I linked that to your acknowledgement of how hard it is to do research on your own work. And I thought in my head that perhaps your process of switching from Fiona talking about the work to Fiona embodying the work has a mirror in your research, the switching of the research hat. So that's why I was playing with the glasses, like you were playing with the glasses, like, because it's for me about lens and frame. So what is the lens that I'm choosing to look? What is the lens that I'm using to look at the work now? And what frame am I using to look through? Yeah. And for me, there's something in that around switching from the research frame to the performer frame, back to the research frame, the fluidity that I saw in your performance. That fluidity, if one brings that fluidity into the research frame, so that you fluidly also move from research voice to performance voice to analyzing my work to being the one who made the work. So there was just something really interesting, and in my own thinking about creative research, this in fact, I think I'm doing a presentation on this very thing for Charlene's group in 2 weeks' time. But the stepping into circles of immersion and back out as an arts researcher. Like, this is the researcher view. Now I'm kind of a director view, looking into the actor performing. Now I'm the actor completely immersed, but still have the witness voice in my head. How am I doing this? And then stepping back out and go, okay, as a director or a facilitator of a process, or as a you know, somebody who's putting up their exhibition, from that's a different distancing, and then a further distance. That was what I was playing with. And I just thought, you know, if you paid attention to what you do as an artist, what does that then give you? What gifts can you find there for what you do as a researcher to switch, yeah, in and out and deeper immersed and further out? Yeah, that journey
Thank you
of
very much.
lenses and frames.
Thank you, Petro. Brett.
Thanks so much. And actually, that's exactly where I hope the conversation would go, because I think a dialogue between speakers today would be great. So the one thing that I've been reflecting on a bit, which is a constraint about this format, but it's great we've got this last session, is that often colleagues tend to work on their own, choose their own theoretical frameworks, and now present. And I'm wondering if any of the frames that someone else is using resonated with anyone who was presenting. And that one really good thing that could come from this dialogue is a sense of a kind of repertoire of approaches to artistic or practice-based research, however we choose to put it, that starts to emerge more as a conversation than, and you know, a kind of individuated PhD project. So I mean, just to give one example, in the first session this morning, Brigitte spoke about stone as a quote unquote geosocial material. I think that's a really compelling idea. And I think a lot of the other projects we've heard about today could also potentially be approached as geosocial materials. And I wondered if anyone would like to just speak to how, if one could maybe step out of one's PhD project at the moment and think about another framework that was presented today, what kind of dialogues we might have in that respect. So I'm kind of reinforcing the question actually to invite presenters today to connect dots between the presentations. Thanks.
Thanks, Brett. I think that's... I'm also just struck, I don't know if Brigitte's here, but of course, Brigitte comes to her artistic research project as an architect. And I was really struck how radical that conception of stone was for an architect. And clearly that is obviously she had that inclination, hence her desire to do an artistic research project. But from the realm of artistic research, it seems to me she's bringing a very radical conception back to architecture.
I see Megan's hand has gone up.
Yeah, please, Megan.
Hi. This is sort of feeding into your provocation, Brett. And it was what I kind of wanted to start out speaking to, which is this wonderful notion of weathering, feminist weathering that Charlene raised, which I was going to say actually has these really interesting potentials for speaking to materialities, as well as feminists. So, you know, there's a tracing of bodies there as well. And so it works epistemically and ontologically in a way where this important kind of tracing that sort of needs to happen can occur in different directions. And for me, it's very interesting because it speaks to diffraction in really interesting ways then, where sort of, you know, converging waves make more patterns. And so I appreciated that along with each other comment that was raised there by David and Alex as well, with the rigor and research through practice. And I was thinking about the presenters, one that I really resonated with, and I'm going to read this PhD and find out more because it's just looks really interesting. And it's this observing arrangements. And I'm sorry, I didn't make a note of, it's Kokomotso, I think.
Yeah, Kokomotso.
Yeah, Komotso's work. Thank you. Yeah, and how that leads to creativity. So this idea of arranging as a system and music as an argument, and yeah, kind of bringing things together, which I think is what artists do in so many ways, you know, kind of bringing things together and filtering it through ourselves and through the world in different ways, which is why the tracing is so interesting and important, but really to also focus on that act of arranging and rearranging, which speaks to weather very nicely as rearranging systems. So that was kind of some thoughts I had.
Thanks very much, Megan. Michelle, were you going to say something?
Yes, Christo, sorry, I just didn't want to interrupt the presenters having their say.
Okay.
Yes, well, my comment was just to Bronwyn, and really it was not at all a criticism, it was just a comment and in correlation with the project that I'm working on at the moment, in terms of your expansive approach to animation, Bronwyn, and the way you're breaking down the language of movements in animation, in particular your negotiation of the animation still. You know, I don't know if this is something that you're developing in your PhD and your theoretical arguments, but also what's quite interesting, it has interesting correlations to Tom Gunning's, you know, he's film theorist and animation theorist, in his discussion of animation's relationship to the notion of the instant and the photographic still. You know, he talks about it as, you know, before it's kind of, one sees the photographic still as something that is negated by the idea of animation or in opposition to it. Was something that I've been finding quite interesting in my own reading of, because I'm looking at something similar to you in terms of the animation still and kind of what happens between movements. And I thought that was just something, an interesting reading, an interesting idea to point out to you, you know, because this kind of thing was not possible in the analog era, and our kind of experience of animation is just in terms of movement. Whereas what I find quite interesting is what you're doing is you kind of moving beyond that and showing something that was invisible before.
Thanks, Michelle. Alex.
Yeah, thank you. Just two short notes. One on what Brett said, and then also what Megan commented. I think this connection, I think it would be really interesting to go in this kind of looking for connections between PhD program or PhD projects. But I think it can be a kind of a multiple matrix involved there. So in terms of practices, in terms of, as you said, Brett, in terms of conceptual frameworks, and also in terms of research object or research focus. No? So I pointed out this the connection between Megan and I forget her name. I can recall it. The person who was working, Janet. Sorry. In terms of opening different perspective on ocean or what is the ocean, what is the sea. So so we have practices, we have conceptual frameworks, we have focus. And the interesting thing is that I'm not mentioning disciplines. And I think for me, this is interesting because this is showing a difference between classical art making and artistic research. Yeah, so I think we can get rid of this disciplinary constraints and go into much more concrete things like practices, conceptual frameworks, and objects of or focus of research. And just a very short comment about what you said, Megan. I think, yeah, art brings things together, but I think before that, art brings things apart. And I think this is exactly these two movements of bringing things apart, so disrupting sedimented conglomerates and then bringing them together. I mean, also the case of Brigitte is very clear. So all these stone formations are consolidated. First, she brings them asunder, and then they bring it together in another way. I think both movements are really constitutive for the kind of research we are interested in.
Alex, thank you very much. I see Charlene's hands up, and then Marilee. Charlene.
Right, thank you. So, I mean, there was some interesting things for me, and certainly some provocations as well. And I think the interesting things when you hear PhD students is that you start thinking in terms of your own artistic practice, you start, you know, contesting your own thoughts around artistic practice as well. And some of the things that, you know, was interesting for me was this kind of conditionality of materiality that came through in a lot of these works. And so rather than this kind of permanence that we're always predisposed of, that there was this conditionality of materiality. And I think particularly in these hectic times, in these times that we find ourselves in, that there's something quite seductive about this kind of conditionality. And also, I think Megan kind of mentioned it. I'm not sure whether it was in the presentation or whether it was in the paper, but this kind of we're voiding, and the void becomes generative. And in terms of that, it also starts to redefine ideas of progress, this kind of Western ideas of progress. And you know, Alex also set up this kind of provocation about whether we should be anthropomorphizing the idea of the inanimate. And for me, that was quite interesting, because I want to say, you know, there's of course there's problems with that, but we also come from cultures where that is very prevalent. And so I wonder if that there's still some value in that as well. What can we take from old world cultures where that kind of methodology, that kind of creative methodology offers some kind of value in that, but where it is educative, especially with regards to matter that matters, and how can we use that in sort of the age in which we are, in terms of being empathetic for those that can't speak. I'm also thinking in terms of one of the things I also really appreciated very much about Roelof's submission was the visuality that was produced, that was sent through the ways in which text was presented as visuality. And this came through in difference of the submissions as well. But the way text and the layout and in the submission becomes its own, you know, its own critique, its own visuality, and I really enjoyed that a lot. You know, as a final comment, you know, just to also push Roelof into thinking a bit more, because I didn't have time to address anything towards Roelof a bit earlier, you know, to sort of think a little bit more around the kind of slippage between setting up the apartheid idea around white homosexuality being regarded as transgressive, and then slipping it into thinking about it as being swart gevaar, because the proximity to othering is not the proximity to blackness. And so that slippage between proximity to othering stretching into the proximity to blackness and the black body becomes a dangerous slope. And so to just consider that a bit more. Yeah, for me to, you know, the sessions that I did catch was a real feast.
Thank you, Charlene. Marilee, and then Komotso.
Thanks, Christo. I wasn't sure whether to make the comment at all, but I'm prompted to maybe make the comment because of the exchange between Fiona and Pietro. And it's something that came up for me with 4 presentations that I was specifically involved with, but also throughout the day. I'm fascinated very much in artistic research paradigms with subjectivity and experiential knowledge, and how one goes about opening up your experiential knowledge, using that as a driver for research as part of your methodology, opening up your creative processes in ways that they can be shared. The reason this is so fascinating for me in a South African context, of course, is because we, until very recently, had this very strong division, and it's not over, in the academia between those who do traditional research and those who mainly make their mark as creative practitioners. And now we have a policy that allows for funding to be made available for creative output. And so this whole big discussion of equivalence between creative output and research, traditional research, is ongoing. It's not being solved, except that the creative research PhD, to my mind, could be one of the ways to begin working at this problem really productively. All that said, still this PhD is called a creative work PhD. It does not align itself specifically with artistic research. And then thinking about Fiona and Pietru's exchange and my own questions to Nicola, for example, how does one go about finding entry points into your experiential knowledge and into your subjectivity? And how do you use that as part of your methodology, a way to energize the research that you're doing? Because this potentially opens up new areas of research, new frontiers for research. And then we're not only talking about the conditions of practice, and we're not talking about the conditions of research, but we start talking about the conditions of artistic research. And I wonder if this is something that the presenters struggle with, whether it's something that they would appreciate more engagement on, perhaps within Arts Research Africa, the series of lectures on artistic research, its history, its many different applications across the disciplines, interdisciplinary applications, different centers in Europe and in Australia, places that have been working in creative research and artistic research for many years. It seems to me that the question of practice and the question of research, those are questions that are interesting and must be dealt with. But the question of artistic research, when is it artistic research? When does artistic research occur? This is something that perhaps could be delved into with more energy and more commitment. That's it. Thanks.
Marilee, thank you very much. And I hope we can take you up on that offer. Komotso, and then Manola, and then Petro.
Yeah, I think towards the closing statements of Marilee's comments, she kind of touched on what I want to touch on. But really, I think, listening to all presentations, there's been a good amount of engagement with methodology. The question that I have, and I'd love to hear from my fellows here, is about the literature review section that relates to practice and their particular encounters and the challenges that they may have had looking at different types of ideas to a point where they were able to refine their own practice and locate their methodologies. So I'm interested in the journeys that our fellows have taken through the literature.
Komotso, I think a very, very important question. Could we hold that for responses from the other presenters, but just take Manola's comment now and then Petro's, and then, but yeah, I hope there will be responses to your question. It's important.
I think one of the questions I wanted to raise here or talk back to, which was provoked a little by Rolop's presentation, was this question about practice and then making art as part of the process. And I think both embodied research and some of the performances research, we've been thinking really in both as individual researchers and practitioners, where the practice itself, is the component of the research, and this pressure to create a separate art object, in a sense, doesn't fully understand what the potency and potential of doing artistic research or practices research really offers. To kind of do this double thing of create an artifact and then also have this, it doesn't fully allow the embodied and creative potential of this as artistic research and creative research. And that's as its epistemic inquiry. And then how does one legibilize what that practice is, then should be the question, rather than is there this creative output? So I think that's an important question that needs to be taken back in terms of how we consider output. And alongside this, I'd like to come back to what Charlene said about the visuality of the text, because again, another experiment to sort of look at what is the other possibility has been the video essay, or the video essay as dense text. So to kind of layer, and I mean, Ben Spatz and Atalanta, the Journal of Embodied Research looks into this possibility of creating the dense video essay as a sort of annotated text that presents itself instead of a research publication, and that this perhaps gives us the option to look at what becomes available in certain performance cultures whose strength and power of gnosis also lies outside of only having to turn back to representation through writings. And I'm thinking of what opened up, what kind of knowledge opened up in Kafela's presentation, and what happens in the sonic, and how that can be converted back in the video essay, if that's seriously taken on as a format. And if ARA is going to go ahead with the website and push forward, I think taking up that kind of a journal possibility should definitely be explored. I think that's something I wanted to respond back to. And to rethink rigor, and we've done this a little bit before in the ARA reading group that we had last year, was to rethink the question of rigor in terms of legibility, and legibility being one of the cornerstones, rather than rethinking what does rigor mean. Yeah, so I think, yeah, these are two things I want to speak back to as much. And just to say that it was so fascinating and exciting that in the ocean work, in all of the others, there's this impossibility for us to sit within the humanities and the arts and not go into scientific thought and knowledge. And some of that transdisciplinary following and tracking is something also that artistic research will have to explore carefully. And there's real possibility and value there that I look forward to.
Manola, thank you very much. Pietro, I'm presuming you behind the Drama for Life. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I can rename myself if I remember.
Tag.
Yeah. Thank you, Christo. Thank you, colleagues, for really important and like, what is it, the word? Juicy conversation. A few things that came up for me in response to what Marilee was saying. It has become clearer and clearer in the preparing for doctoral studies in the arts short course that the relationship and conversation between conventional research and creative research is an important one, but shouldn't sort of dominate the conversation. I was very pleased to see at this symposium how there was no binary created, and that we were really looking at the value and characteristics of this thing we call creative research. I find that valuable, and the word that popped into my head now was happy making. So it's a very academic word, happy making. So what I did find was in the work with people preparing to do their doctoral studies and choosing between creative or conventional, which is kind of the choice that is offered by the standing orders. What really is important is, Marilee went and spoke about your entry into the work. For me, there is something very important about the research impetus and its relationship to the making, to the practice, and to the immersion in the practice, which is very different from conventional research that wants to create a kind of proposal and a frame where I'm going, where creative research really wants to remain in a mess for a longer time and figuring it out by making and through performance and through the non-verbal or the multimedia modal processes. And one of the frames that I found really useful is the idea of the third research paradigm, or what Tune Oosten refers to as in alignment with post-qualitative, though post-qualitative still references itself in relation to qualitative, but there is a third paradigm developing that really centers the knowledge making that comes from making, from doing, from making, from expressing, and from following the hunches, the muses, the impetuses of the work in its messiness and its unfolding, which should be centralized. And for me, then there is a relationship to rigor for me, and for me, the relationship to rigor that is preempted by this, and I'm still looking for the language. Maybe I should stand up and make noise and movement to try and tell you what I'm thinking. But the relationship to rigor for me is the relationship and the ability to express the question and the questioning, but be very true to following the impetuses of the making, and trusting that as part of the rigor. So, like, you know, I don't know if you can talk about the level of immersion. You know, I don't know if there are levels of immersion, but there is a knowledge making that happens when you're in it that doesn't happen when you are looking from an about it perspective. I don't want to discount the about it perspective in any way. I think that's what makes it research, is the ability to also then have an about it, but it's the relationship between the two that shifts. And that then, for me, all of these things connect, but then speaks to the role of the affective and of the subjective, and its relationship to the bigger picture. So again, for me, it's about frame, lens, in and out, and the ability to transgress in and out.
Sure, thank you. Very, very rich, many possibilities in what you're suggesting. Nicola, and then Margareta, and then Sam. So, Nicola. You're on mute. You're on mute.
The big challenge, I think, of this creative PhD is really, while writing and researching, bearing in mind that I am an artist first of all, and it's extremely exhausting remembering these things every day. I mean, that your main language is sculpture and performance, in my case, and not writing. And I think that an artwork can be defined so because it allows the viewer to go in many directions. And this is just possible through a certain degree of abstraction, mystery that the artwork should embody. And this is crucial, really crucial to me, in order to avoid illustrative work or like worst case scenario propaganda. Or if your practice is really structured in a way that you aim to reach this kind of stratification of meaning, then the act of writing become extremely challenging. And I mean, I know that in a scientific context, this might appear as imprecise, generic, or simply too many irons on the fire. But again, for me, it's extremely important to leave freedom to interpretation, and at the expense maybe of a less precise connection between theory and practice. So these two elements has definitely to grow simultaneously, but I don't want to put theory of masculinity inside my work, like pushing, and not like just forcing masculinity theory into my visual work. That's a big challenge. These two things has to grow together. I don't know if I was clear. I mean, yeah.
Nicola, thank you very much. I think that resonates with everybody who's struggling with these different modes of investigation but I can see Margarita has been nodding while you were speaking, and I think definitely has something to say on these topics. Margarita, and then Sam, and then Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and also for, I didn't say thank you before for the whole invitation to take part in that process. I want to take up, I think Sam was first, but I anyway wanted to refer to you, Samuel. So if it is okay for you, I go on speaking, because what I enjoyed very much here is also that the role of the moderation that Samuel Ramengai was taking in our session, and that helped extremely also to connect not only the different research projects, but also the different methods of artistic research, and also this misspelling I heard before to connect the different artistic research programs. It also happened. It connects different artistic research programs, because in every program, as I experienced this over the last 4 years in Vienna and Austria, when I was running the program there, that we speak about what methods can be used. And Samuel was summing up very much also the common approaches that you see in very different ways, how to develop artwork within the research question, within the method that you choose, and within developing an episteme, a kind of knowledge that is also accessible and transferable to others, to connect in a discourse. Because we had this problem of writing. A new form of writing needs to be accepted, I'm pretty sure. Then it is no more that difficult, but we need to be referenced in this network of references and trusts, and that we establish a discourse and a reflexive discourse culture. And I think that is a very important part, first of all, which I could see here. And I was seeing these different approaches also, especially also when Vela was performing and having a ritual with us together. And so he was exactly doing that before was mentioned also, maybe I should make noise, you say it, or so. So he was making noise and demonstrating us how his playmaking happens. This chochuala, this playmaking, which is taken out of a culture, and also connecting to Fiona again, performing something that also maybe is not your own culture, which has also an empathy research factor that was very interesting. And with Samuel, I could feel that we were really connecting also into a discourse that goes into a political dimension with these methods and the different approaches that we have. And for me, it is, first of all, I don't know if this is really your terminology, it's not the conventional versus creative research, because especially when working with sciences, which I experienced a lot, that every natural science research needs to be creative in order to be accepted. So it's very dangerous if we say we are the ones who know creative things. That's the only thing I would say. We are the ones who know the arts method, and that is something which we really can contribute, I think. And so only this creative change of the world can happen. But this leads to, probably we're discussing world building also. Maybe we shouldn't change the world. We were always adapting the world. That was not the best thing for mankind. We should adapt our social system and methods, and that's what we exercise here. Thank you for that experience that I could make with you together. Samuel, I think I did not address you directly, but maybe I just hand over to you.
Okay. Samuel.
Thank you, Christo. My contribution is slightly at a tangent, but it touches on something that Lucas initially raised about, so what next with these kinds of presentations, and what kind of sustained connections can be established between the panelists and the presenters, so that the work has more life after this. That's where I'm coming through. I think there was a time that the drama cluster in South Africa used to run what they called Dramatic Spaces Conference. I think it was a biannual conference. And part of the output of that conference biannually was to produce or collect a series of papers, maybe 6 or 8 of the best papers from that. And the South African Theatre Journal would devote a space to publishing those kinds of works. Listening to the different biographies of colleagues, I noticed there are quite a number of colleagues who are involved in editing a number of journals within the school. I know about Dolamba Lindelwa, myself, and many others that I don't know, and Petro, and of course ARA, which is the artistic research journal that you are producing. So I was wondering, and this is a proposal, Christo, that either the presenter will have a sustained relationship with one panelist or their supervisor or whoever they would like to work with in order to develop and fine-tune a paper from these presentations, so that we can suggest ways in which perhaps the journals that are open to this can take up those opportunities and publish the papers. Well, there we go. You got a supporter, Lucas. That's how I see the work going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. When I heard that you'd taken up the editorship of the South African Theatre Journal, it was my hope that that would lead to opportunities for publishing out of these projects in the school. So that's very encouraging. Alex.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just again, 2 small contributions to the debate. One is, I think, instead of thinking how does artistic research can fit in the academia, I think the question can be, how can artistic research help academia? And I think one of the ways that we can do it is showing that there is no such a thing as a division between theory and practice, that this is a absolute absurd and not useful at all construction. So what then? if we disrupt this kind of a big fundamental dogma of academia, what do we offer? Well, do we offer practices, different practices? For example, conceptual and sensuous aesthetic practices. So to move on a common base which is highly integrative of practices. Yeah. There are some practices that produce artifacts that can be called a theory. That's fine, but this does not imply that these practices are less practice, that the other practices that produce other kinds of artifacts. You know? I think for me, this is a much viable way that constantly kind of struggling between these perverse constructions, I would say. And the other point for me is that is the mandatory presence of writing. Yeah. So I think it's one of the things that characterize art in the 20th and 21st century, but especially in the 20th century, is that the absolute extension of all media and the nivellation of all media. Everything can be a media, and there is no privileged medium. Yeah? So to accept that one medium, in this case, language or written language, is a privileged research medium, it goes against artistic, the intrinsic artistic evolution. So I think we should not. My position is to not accept this. And open up the space to recognize the epistemic value of each medium articulated through artistic practices.
Alex, thank you very much. I'd like to just take us back to a comment that David made in his session, speaking as a panelist, and he commented on the rigor. And I think that's been something that keeps coming up in a lot of the discussion. And I see Fuad couldn't come back, but he left a question following up from David's remark in the chat, which I'd just like to read, and then ask David just to reflect a bit further on this notion of rigor in relation to artistic research. And Fuad's comment was, what about rigor in creative and practice-led research processes? What is the role of critical thinking in terms of engaging with visual and audio recording? I find there is an exciting potential for critical self-reflection, for example, when it comes to the use of African languages in the sound of some of the videos. I would be keen to hear about the process of recording, perhaps drawing from critical anthropology, for example, how and if these recordings were accompanied by personal engagement, dialogue, and/or translation. Without this, such voice recordings could appear as opaque content, which would then need to be theorized as well. So, David, I don't know if that goes outside of where you were thinking about rigor, but I'd really like to hear you say something more about rigor in relation to the work that has been presented here, and maybe more generally in regard to artistic research.
Thanks, Christo. I'll just say something briefly. I mean, this goes back to my own PhD work in the first decade of the 2000s. And this morning I mentioned the work of William Dole, who's a curriculum theorist. And I mentioned the 4 R's of curriculum that he proposed, as opposed to the traditional 3 R's of curriculum going back to the 19th century, reading, writing, arithmetic, the early 20th century. And just to repeat what I said earlier on, he speaks about or writes about curriculum in relation to recursion, richness, relations, and then rigor. And when he writes about rigor, he writes in a way where there's a particular rigor that is associated with what happens in the academic world. And he encourages us to think about different logics of rigor. And he's not talking about artistic research. He's not referring to artistic research at all. But he doesn't write about this extensively, but he thinks about rigor in terms of these many, many different possibilities that are present. And this process, if I remember correctly what he wrote, of never feeling that one has got it exactly right. And in reading that, there's something that I connected very, very strongly with in terms of my interest in the relationship between pedagogy and artistic practice and artistic research. And it was if I understood that there could be this very different understanding of logic within the, not logic, different understanding of rigor in an institution like Wits University. But I think that this is a much, much longer conversation. And I think what struck me about what Brigitte, Janet, Megan, and Roelof, their presentations, and the others that I managed to listen to throughout the day, is this the sense of a different logic of, and it's not something that can be packaged neatly. And here I'm thinking about Janet's question in the chat, and also linking it to some of the writing by someone like Sarat Maharaj on methodologies in artistic research. So let me leave it there, and I certainly think it's something worth picking up in further discussions, and informally and more formally as part of Arts Research Africa. Thanks, Christo.
Thank you, David. We'll definitely try and pick that up in future. And I'm hearing, as with Marilee's suggestion, for a more rigorous presentation of autistic research. These are all future opportunities for further dialogue. I see we are approaching our finishing time, and Zanella is very strict, I think rightly, about keeping to our temporal commitments. So I would like to thank everybody, the presenters in particular. As Margareta pointed out in our podcast discussion, which I highly recommend to you all, autistic research is particularly demanding for the students doing it, in that it requires being responsive to criticism and feedback in a way that isn't usually required in strictly art practice. And I think that is very much due to the intellectual content, which is inseparable from artistic research, even if it is strongly focused on practice. And as Komotso, I thought, very insightfully said, when practitioners develop the questions out of their understanding of practice, it's very different to when an outsider, a non-practitioner, tries to formulate questions about the same sort of challenge. And that's why I particularly appreciate that our PhD candidates put themselves forward and did these presentations. I hope that this experience and the discussion has been valuable for you. And we certainly are planning to have this colloquium as at least an annual event, because there are a number of other PhDs who haven't had the opportunity to present. And of course, there's going to be new PhDs coming in. And this kind of discussion, this way of engaging, I think is enormously valuable for everybody concerned in this very exciting yet inchoate area of investigation, critical thinking, and collective activity. So thank you all very, very much. And we'll certainly be in touch early in the week, hopefully to get some feedback from you all on what could have been done better, and have even more effective colloquium the next time around.